Yeah, so my name is Caroline Mak, and before Dr. McDonald walks us through some of the key findings of this report, let me just give you an overview of what is in this report and define some terms you'll hear throughout the webinar. So first, the main feature of this report, in its many editions since 2004, is ranking every state by voter turnout based on voting eligible population, which I'll define soon. These numbers have been collected by the U.S. Elections Project since 1980. Because we have these numbers every major election, we can compare the 2020 presidential election to 2016's and see how states changed with policies as well. With that, we highlight the correlations we find of featured election policies and state-by-state turnout and turnout growth. So before we continue with those findings, let me define some terms. Since this is a diverse crowd of nonprofit staff and researchers, we just want to make sure everyone can follow. So the first definition is just voter turnout. Voter turnout is just the number of votes over the number of people eligible to vote. So to put a tiny bit of math in an example, if 8 people vote out of a group of 10 eligible voters, that voter turnout is 80%. Easy. So let's go a little deeper into this number of people eligible to vote. So that's not the whole population, but the voting eligible population, or what we call VEP. That's the number of citizens 18 and over with adjustments based on state laws, like exclusions based on past convictions, etc. One of the key reasons of this report is to use the U.S. Elections Project's official estimates of VEP based on the census to meaningfully compare turnout between the states. Without these estimates, a lot of states use the number of registered voters in their state instead of the total population. So let me just give another small example of why this isn't as useful. So in our first example, we had 8 people vote out of a group of 10 eligible voters. So that was the VEP. What happens if we don't use VEP? Let's say in this group of 10, one person is unregistered and one person missed the deadline to register. So only 8 people are registered. In that case, a voter turnout without VEP is 8 people voting out of a group of 8 registered voters, which is a voter turnout of 100%. So in our report, we use VEP to compare states' turnout based on their actual voting eligible population and not just who is currently registered. Okay, just a few more slides to define how we talk about policies, and then we'll get into the findings. The first is early voting. You may already know that early voting is when voters have certain times and days that they can vote before the election, but there are 2 ways that states do this. They can have multiple early voting locations that voters can go to in their precinct or county, or they may have what's called in-person absentee, which is when you can basically request and return your mail ballot at the election office on the spot. We got these numbers from reports like this one from Nebraska, where they break out total voting by method, and you can see the number of early votes in the box. Sometimes, though, states that have in-person absentee don't break out absentee votes by mail versus absentee votes in person. And so just in those cases, we either estimate, do best guess estimate, but we'll have final numbers when states report their numbers to the Federal Election Administration Voting Survey later in the year. So we will also use the term mail ballots. We are talking about any time ballots are mailed to a voter. Many voters know this as absentee or vote by mail. We'll also use the term vote at home, which refers to states that use mail ballots, but instead proactively mail registered voters a ballot, like in Colorado, Washington, or Oregon. With vote at home, voters don't have to find, print, mail, and return a ballot request application form. We'll also use the term mail restricted, which includes states that limit who can vote with a mail ballot, often known as excuse states, or that require notary, witness, or ID. And even though these are mail ballots, voters can also choose to drop them off in person at drop boxes or offices, which actually most do. So our last term to define are registration deadlines. So registration deadlines are any cutoff date where voters cannot register for an upcoming election, either online or by mail. So the policy we'll be referring to is same-day registration, where voters can register to vote and cast their ballot on the same day. This is also known as election day registration. In contrast, There are states that also have 4-week deadlines, which the cutoff is actually 25 to 30 days before the election. These states still have those deadlines from a time when we had paper-only systems. So in this report and the webinar, you'll see findings relating to these policies and turnout. However, there are some things that you won't see because we don't have the data yet, but we are really looking forward to finding out. One is how these policies impact certain demographics like race, age, and income. And the other is actually the impact of a really big policy, automatic voter registration, which, because it's newer and because of COVID DMV closures, we don't yet have enough data to say much conclusively. Okay, so I'm done. Let me turn it over to Michael, who, actually Caitlin, who will introduce Michael and walk us through the report findings.
Thank you, Caroline. So real quick, I actually want to do a little poll. Michael is going to talk to us in a moment about how people voted, but I want to know how you all voted. This is an anonymous poll. So I would love for you to tell us, how did you vote in the 2020 general election? Did you vote early in person, early by mail ballot, on election day, or maybe you didn't or you could not vote? While we run that poll, I am going to introduce Dr. Michael P. McDonald. He is the Associate Professor of Political Science at University of Florida. His research interests are in the areas of elections and methodology. His voter turnout research shows that turnout is not declining, the ineligible population is rising. On the practical side, Dr. McDonald has worked for the National Exit Poll Organization, consulted to the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, consulted to the Pew Center for the states, and has worked as a media consultant to the Associated Press, ABC, and NBC. If you were following election-related coverage before, during, or after the election this year, you probably saw him quoted in that coverage, and he has helped us with this America Goes to the Polls report through the U.S. Elections Project for many years now. So I am very pleased to introduce Michael.
Thank you very much, Caitlin, and thank you to all of the Nonprofit Voter Engagement Network folks. I serve on the board of the Nonprofit Voter Engagement Network, and I really am dedicated to helping people vote in this country and help and assist nonprofits with that mission. And during this election, running up to it, and during it, I was providing data and assistance to a wide range of nonprofit organizations to help them, assist them in their goals of encouraging more voter participation. You can see my information on the screen. I can see we got our poll results back, and 60% of you voted by mail, and yeah, that's about right. Maybe we're a little bit more higher than the national average, which is something that we'll get to. I myself voted by mail early, as well as many other people. Anyway, so my contact information is there, the website, and you can follow me on Twitter if you want really snarky commentary about politics. You want to go on to the next screen there? So in 2020, we had 160 million, just shy of 160 million people participate in the election. That's the most number of people who have ever participated in a US election. Really remarkable. And it's the highest as a turnout rate of those eligible to vote since 1900. So 120 years since we've had a turnout rate that is, 2/3 or higher of those who are eligible to vote. Again, a remarkable election. If we were to pin a reason on why we had such extraordinary turnout, probably has a lot to do with Donald Trump. In 2018, we had the highest midterm turnout rate since 1914. And yet, just 4 years earlier in 2014, we had the lowest turnout rate since 1942. 42. And there's only one thing that changed in our politics between 2014 and 2018. The election laws did not become so much more progressive that more people were able to vote because of changes to laws. The elections had not become so much more competitive. The only really big change in our politics was Donald Trump. And clearly that carried through to the 2020 election, high levels of engagement. And if we look at that high level of engagement, it was also fueled by the pandemic and Black Lives Matter protests over the summer. The issues that people care about were very important in 2020. There were surveys by organizations like Pew Survey Research that found a record number of people, according to any of the polls that they'd ever conducted, saying that this was an important election. So people cared and they wanted to participate. And yet they also wanted to participate in the midst of a pandemic. And how were they going to do that? It was not clear going into the fall election that states were necessarily going to be able to pull this off. There had been some problems during the primary elections. And yet we held a very successful election. And we should be thankful to all the election administrators who and volunteer there were polls out there, polling locations, just as there was mail balloting. A lot of people risked themselves, and actually a few people died from COVID exposure who were participating in elections. And of course, we have also to thank the voters and the efforts of the nonprofit community to encourage and engage people to vote as well. So we managed to do something I think is quite remarkable, have this very high turnout election in a very, very trying time. Go on to the next slide. So how do we do it? Well, we're echoing some themes that we've seen in prior reports on Americans Goes to the Polls. There are certain states that have higher turnout rates than others. And in this case, we're seeing the high turnout states. And Minnesota had, it rounds up to 80.0%. It's just shy of, it's like 79.97% turnout, but it's darn close to 80%. That's a really remarkable turnout rate for a U.S. election within any state. That's the highest that we've seen in modern elections for any state in the country. And there's certain policies that seem to matter. One of them is same-day registration. Same-day registration helps people who aren't currently registered to vote come in and participate if they wish to do so. It may be, though, and this is when we're just getting preliminary data now. So down the road, we're going to get more data from the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. I'll be very interested to see how many people actually did same-day registration, because the other policy that we see seems to matter to turnout, and I'll show this in different ways, was mail balloting. States that ran all mail ballot elections were among those that had among the top turnout rate states. Those that moved to all mail ballot elections for the first time in 2020 also saw very sizable increases in turnout, even if they weren't in the top states for turnout overall. But if more people were voting by mail, they would not have been voting or taking advantage of same-day registration. So it's possible that we're going to see fewer people taking advantage of same-day registration. And I think also there's very good evidence that people were very highly engaged, and they knew the laws and they knew their state's policies in ways that they really hadn't before, because there was so much information in the news media and through nonprofit partners to get out the word about how to vote, that people were very informed and people were registering, people were casting their ballots earlier if they were voting by mail than they did in prior elections. So it could be too that we're going to see a decline in actually small same-day registration, because there was so much information that people had. Again, we really don't have these numbers yet because the states haven't really reported them, but this is something that we hopefully will get later in the year. Go on to the next slide. If we flip this around and we look at states that had restrictive voting laws in some way, maybe you had to have a 4-week deadline for registering to vote. Perhaps there was an excuse and COVID was not a legitimate excuse in your state, or at least a very widespread legitimate reason, may have been narrowly tailored by some states to who might qualify, or if a state had some other impediment to casting mail ballots, something like some states that require a copy of a photo identification or a notary in order to cast or request a mail ballot. When we look at these states, they all tend to show up on the bottom end of the turnout scale. You know, that's the bad news. If there's one silver lining here, we can say is that Oklahoma was at 55% of those eligible to vote, which is still very good for turnout rates in this country. Certainly we could be higher in some of these states, perhaps, if we changed the laws, but and some people wanted to vote, and some people were getting over those impediments, even if they were in place before them. Go next slide. Another way to look at this is to not just look at which states have higher turnout, but think about the change in turnout. And the reason why we like looking at changes like this is that then we can say whatever is special about this particular state, maybe it's the culture in the state, maybe it's the competitiveness of the state, maybe it's particular laws in the state. We can control for that in some ways by looking at the same state at the same point in time in 2016. And when we look at the states that had the highest turnout rate increases, we see that many of them were vote by mail states. Places like Hawaii, which ran their first all-mail ballot election for a presidential election in 2020, saw the largest increase in turnout. And Hawaii's perpetually been at the lower end of turnout in the country. So it's very heartening to see that people were engaged in Hawaii and they were able to participate. Now, for these other states that are on here, and then there are a number that either had existing policies in place for vote at home, or were implementing for the first time. Either this was scheduled first time in the presidential election, or they were doing it on an emergency basis because of the COVID situation. I'm not certain to say that it was mail balloting that increased turnout in these states. Rather, I think it was that people wanted to participate, and some people wanted to be safe as they participated, and mail balloting offered that opportunity for people to participate in a safe manner so that they could participate. So next slide. All right, so how do people vote? Let's go, I sort of previewed some of the policies that we think matter, but we actually do have data on how people voted in the 2020 election. I was collecting a lot of this data in the run-up to the election, pulling together data from various sources and publishing it on the web so that people could see what was happening in the state of the election, at least the number of people who had already voted, and maybe the party registration and other characteristics of those people on a website on my election project website. So we collected a lot of data. And although these are not final data, again, I just want to stress that in some cases we are collecting data from states that in ways that maybe it's coming from a voter file or something like that. And it's not the final data because we don't have that final data released from the state in order to calculate the true number of mail ballots, for example. We're probably pretty close. And then by the end of this year, the U.S. Election Assistance Commission should produce some additional data, and that should get us, a much clearer picture of where the usage of, say, mail balloting or in-person early voting or election same-day registration was in the 2020 election. So these are preliminary. Just want to stress that I think they're pretty good. I think the patterns here are going to hold up, but I wouldn't say if I give you a percentage number, it's not going to be the final number in some cases. I think we're going to still see some adjustments to the numbers. So if we just go on. So roughly only 30% of the people voted on election day in the country. Nearly half, 45%, well, maybe a little bit more, voted by mail. and another quarter of the people voted by in-person early across the country. So around 70% of the people voted early. That is really remarkable. If we go on to the next screen, you're going to see why this is so remarkable. We've seen a steady increase of early voting by any means, both by mail and in person over time. Steady increase over time, and this is, it's a little deceptive. We're going 2000 to 2008 to 2016, so it's not quite linear. But from 2016 to 2020, we almost saw a doubling of usage of early voting in over a single election year. Yeah, and that increase has been happening. It's been creeping up as states adopt all-mail balloting. That's why some people are, of course, voting earlier, and more states adopting those policies. Once a state adopts a more permissive form of early voting, you tend to see more people use it over time. And so some of this increase is coming from voters changing their behavior and taking advantage of those policies that states are implementing, even if it's not an all-mail ballot state. People want to vote in person early or by mail. So we've seen this general slight creeping up of early voting over time, but we really saw this huge increase in 2020. If we go to the next slide, we can see what's really driving that. Again, is the mail balloting. These are the percentages that are reported by the U.S. Census Bureau. And I'm taking a best guess on the 2020 number when we finally get the final reports. It's a little bit higher than that other number I just showed you, but that's because those are the numbers we've collected. This is my best guess. My guess is we'll be over 45%. And again, nearly more than a doubling of the mail ballot usage. So clearly, in the midst of this pandemic, people wanted to vote by mail, and this was the method of choice for nearly a majority of the voters in the country to participate in the election. Next slide. As we've been collecting this data from states, and again, take these numbers what they are, they're preliminary, but we can see this, something that I've already said before, which is we can see there's a clear correlation between turnout and mail balloting in the country. Those states down in the lower left-hand corner, they all tended to have low mail ballot usage. They had some restrictive law in mail balloting. It was either no excuse or an excuse required state that was not providing a COVID exemption, or at least broadly providing it to anybody who wanted to socially distance. It was states that had these ID laws or notary requirements. They're all clumped down there in the bottom. And if you look at on the other end, on the top right, you'll see states that are all mail ballot states. They tend to be at the very top in terms of turnout. And in between, there are lots of variations. States are implement mail balloting in different ways. That's why I don't think that we can just look at, say, a simple whether or not a state was offering no excuse absentee voting as a way to gauge as whether or not that policy had an effect on turnout, because the implementation of mail balloting varies a lot. Did the state require identification? What was the deadline for when people were requesting mail ballots? Some had very early deadlines to even request that were weeks in advance of the election, like Kentucky. When were those mail ballots allowed to be returned? Were there drop boxes that were available to voters? Just all these nuances that you can't capture them with the simple on or off switches, whether or not you had no excuse or all mail ballot elections. The thing you need to look at is the usage. How many people were using mail ballots, because that usage is reflective of all of the basket of all of these different state policies behind the implementation of mail balloting. Next slide. And one last slide on all this is to look at this in this change, looking from 2016 to 2018. So that last one was just simple bivariate scatter plot correlation of usage of mail ballots with turnout rates. Here I'm looking at the increase, and all states increased. Again, that's the good news, but the increase of turnout from 2016 to 2018. And again, you're seeing these green states here are those that had all mail ballot elections. The red states are those that had some sort of restriction in the way in which they were delivering mail ballots. And you can generally see that there does appear that those states that had all mail ballot elections had higher turnout, and those that were more restrictive had lower turnout. It's not ironclad. This is not determinative. Clearly, a state like Texas that was entering the battleground in 2020 and had become more competitive in the presidential election, people were more interested in voting, and they were showing up to vote, even if the state, and there was a lot of litigation in the state, if the state really didn't make it mail balloting widely available as some other states did. You know, there are other things that are going on here, but it's very unusual to see in such easy to see terms these correlations when we do social science research. Usually you have to do some sort of multivariate analysis using statistics and regressions of that nature. When you can see things on a simple scatter plot like I just showed in the prior slide, it tells you that there was something there. And again, I don't think it was necessarily that it was mail balloting that increased turnout. I think it was more that in a time of a pandemic, when people really wanted to vote, I said over a year ago that we were looking at a record turnout rate for the 2020 election. People wanted to vote, and mail balloting provided a safe way for people to do so. And I think that's the driving force. And unfortunately, in some states that didn't really make it easy to vote a mail ballot, we didn't see quite nearly the increase in turnout or the higher turnout rates that we might have seen otherwise if they had done so, because there were probably some people who were very concerned with their personal safety and decided not to participate in the election. But again, even with that, you know, negative thing aside, we can still see, even in Oklahoma, where you had to have a notary to cast a mail ballot, we still saw a turnout rate increase from 2016. And with that, I will hand it back over to Caroline, I believe.
Thank you, Michael. So despite all these gains in policy changes and choices voters are taking advantage of, millions of people are still unregistered. Most states don't have vote at home or same-day registration. So beyond turnout, how would vote at home and same-day registration benefit the people you serve? Let's start with vote at home. Vote at home makes voting more convenient and much less of a burden. Because ballots are mailed to registered voters automatically, there's no need to have access to a printer, take time off of work, stand in long lines, etc. Voters have time to review and research what's on their ballot, ask their family questions, learn more about complex ballot measures, or down ballot candidates that they've never heard of, but impact their day-to-day lives. It's easier to vote for people with limited mobility or who lack transportation to polling places. And lastly, there's always a paper trail when voters fill out a paper ballot, and they can always drop it off in person if they choose not to mail it. So in 2020, here are the states that had vote at home policies, and 6 actually had full vote at home for the first time in a presidential election. You can see this chart in the report. You'll also be able to find in the report this map of where mail ballots are gaining usage. And you can see kind of how we broke down the percentages of mail ballot usage in the different colorings. So now to same-day registration. How does this policy reduce barriers to voting? While voters may be aware of the election date itself, they are much less likely to be familiar with their state's voter registration deadline, which can be an arbitrary number of days before the election. It's already hard to keep track, and even more so when you're trying to survive. By not having a cutoff, people who experience housing instability, younger people, and anyone who isn't a homeowner who hasn't moved in 10 years benefits. It also helps maintain more accurate voter rolls when voters can update their registration when they vote, since more than half of same-day registrations are updates. However, even with this policy, it's still important for people to register early so they can get mail ballots, but it's a fail-safe for any eligible voter who might have missed a deadline. This map of where same-day registration is gaining usage, you can also refer to in the report. So with the benefits of those policies, what role can you play? So you have two roles or choices. One is education. You can ensure that voters you serve understand their rights and how to vote. The other is advocacy. On behalf of those people, you can also support expanded access to voting, modernizing elections to reduce the barriers they face. Your organization has the trust and the access needed to help your voters. We've mentioned earlier in the benefits that these policies especially benefit the people your nonprofit may serve, people who face housing instability or homelessness, people who lack transportation or have limited mobility, people whose daily lives and challenges may prevent them from remembering to update their address or having the time they need to learn about the offices. And so here's the things that you'll find in the toolkit. We know it's not your main service, so we've provided some tools to make it easier for you to do this work. We'll share a link in the follow-up email, but there are things like pre-made templates and materials, like the slide decks and discussion activities that you can do with your clients. And we do hope you find these tools useful. We also encourage you to identify partners in your local or state coalitions that follow these positive reforms. And that's the most sure way to get latest information on policies advancing in your state and what you may be able to do about it. So we've talked about some of those policies that kind of have election administration reform. We also just want to mention quickly that there are ways to increase enthusiasm around voting and voter turnout through competition. And so competition has impacts on turnout, and we can see this in the report from the difference between battleground states and non-battleground states. And we can see consistently that battleground states with more competition consistently show turnout advantages between 4 to 8 percentage points. This is by presidential election. By making it easier for eligible voters to participate, there are just more ways to drive turnout, like these policies and proposals to increase competition. One is nonpartisan redistricting as a solution to gerrymandering. Another is moving towards a national popular vote to take competition to all 50 states. And ranked choice voting to increase competition, remove incentives for polarizing politics, and give voters a greater choice. It's possible that instituting these policies can have increased competition and a positive impact on turnout. So check out our redistricting webinar, the National Popular Vote Compact, and Fair Vote to learn more about these policies. So that is all on my end. I'm going to stop screen sharing and turn it back to Caitlin.
Thanks so much, Caroline. So we're about to move into our question and answer session. I just wanted to say, regarding, these policies and these tools that we have made available, we hope this is informative and it can help increase voter turnout in your respective states. However, policy is not a substitute for the labor-intensive work of talking to the communities that you serve about getting registered, the process of voting, and reminding them when it comes time to vote. So you can see all the rest of our online resources and upcoming webinars for everything you need to know about running a nonpartisan voter engagement effort with the communities you serve. So now that I've done that plug, let's dive into these questions because there are so many good ones. So I think I will pose the first one to you, Michael. Do you have thoughts on effective elements or criteria for more effective implementation of options for voting early? Like, what are the main policy implementation factors that you'd point to make that system really work for voters?
Well, I think Colorado has the best system for voting in the country, and they're really firing on all cylinders. They have mail balloting, but they also have in-person early voting at what we call vote centers for people who wish to participate that way. And Colorado is a same-day registration state, so these vote centers also serve that purpose of serving communities that may not be registered to vote to participate in the election because they can participate at those vote centers. I've had some communication with the Secretary of State's office in Colorado. I know that the number of people who are using vote centers declined from 2016, from 11% to about 6% in 2020. So it was clear that more people were voting by mail, even as turnout rates went up in Colorado. Colorado has the second highest turnout in the country. So they're also, at the very top. It was difficult when we make those comparisons of turnout increases. It was hard for them to go much higher than they already were because they were already had such a high level of turnout. But what are they doing right? It's sending the mail ballots, giving people the opportunity to vote in person if they wish to do so, having those drop boxes. If there was one thing that I would like to see different in Colorado that I think is a good practice elsewhere would be allowing the later return of ballots, because we do see that ballots are being rejected if they aren't returned by a deadline, and especially during the pandemic, the slowed mail was affecting the way in which mail was being delivered, and mail ballots in particular. Again, the good news I could see from states like Colorado and Oregon and Washington that were all mail ballot elections in both 2016 and 2020, we could see more people returning their ballots sooner. So people were very aware that there were problems with the mail delivery, and they were taking proactive steps to make sure that their voices were going to be heard. But that may not necessarily be true in future elections. So a couple of extra days of returning those ballots will help people. And there were a few states that did that on, at least on a temporary basis, because they could see what had happened during the primaries, and they made some emergency procedures to allow ballots to come back a little bit later, just in case voters were missing those deadlines.
I would also be absolutely remiss if I did not bring up our wonderful partners at the National Vote at Home Institute that have put so much work and thought into developing guidelines, operation toolkits, really wonderful resources for both voters and for election officials about how things like a vote at home system can be implemented with all the bells and whistles that make it equitable, secure, and really convenient for voters. And I think driving that turnout with those things like, the right kind of timing that you just mentioned, Michael. My next question, Caroline, if you can hop on, I think you have an answer to this one. So someone was asking about non-participation. So we saw great turnout this year, but what studies are you aware of and learnings do we have about the people who aren't voting? Why aren't they voting?
I think of the Knight Foundation report. I forget the exact title, but there's I'd have to pull that one up to get the exact reasons, but definitely like a lot of our work around nonprofits and voter engagement, it's around trust, it's around voter education, it's around like having someone who you trust as a messenger giving you that like education, giving you the awareness that, oh, a local election is happening, all of the things that maybe you didn't realize how that local election official impacted your day-to-day life. And so that's where a lot of our work is. In terms of study, I'd have to look that up and get back to you on that one.
I would add that the major survey that's going to reveal a lot of questions about race, because there were some questions about the racial effects of different laws and things of that nature, and who votes and who doesn't vote, and the reasons why, will come from the Census Bureau. Every 2 years, the Current Population Survey has a voting and registration supplement. It's a very large scale survey, and it's got a long time series of similar questions about voting. They don't ask partisan questions because it's the federal government, so they don't ask who you voted for, but we do know a wealth of information about the people who don't vote and who aren't registered. And we can certainly see that people who don't vote or register tend to be younger. They tend to be more often persons of color. They also tend to be people of lower education levels. And that just is, there's a lot of social science research and voting behavior research that shows that those are things that are highly correlated with turnout. People who are whiter, older, wealthier, better educated. Those are the sorts of people who tend to vote.
Thank you for that. We did have a question about demographics. And so, as you both have stated, we won't really know those numbers for a couple more months minimally. But looking at past election years, do we have any sense about which communities take advantage of which methods of voting, in person, early, et cetera?
Yeah, again, that's going to come from the current population survey that's been asking those questions, but you can also see it in some state data already, because we do have individual level data that you can link with the voter file data to try to answer these questions. We certainly know that more Democrats were voting by mail in this last election. That was without a doubt. And that actually bucked a trend that we'd seen in prior years, where it was usually more Republicans that were voting by mail. Now, there are a lot of differences among states. So, if you're in an all-mail ballot state, that's a lot different than a state where you have a choice of the method in which you vote. Conversely, in prior elections, we'd seen more Democrats vote in person early. And in this last election, we saw more Republicans voting in person early. Again, everything was turned on its head. But the interesting thing about the whole situation was that overall, we still saw a lot of people voting early. They just changed the way in which they voted early. And so even if we might see these partisan differences, and if you're seeing these partisan differences, you might assume incorrectly that there are some racial and age and education differences embedded in there as well. Overall, we still saw more people voting early in this election, and that's by whatever method, in person early or by mail.
That leads us right into my next question. Have you looked at turnout, Michael, compared to states' partisan lean or competitiveness? Many of the lower states seem to be heavily one party or the other, or they're gerrymandered. So what's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a very strong correlation with the competitiveness of a state in terms of battleground and turnout. It makes sense on two accounts. On one account, look, the campaigns are spending more resources in those states. They're advertising, they're doing voter mobilization drives. A lot of nonprofit organizations are in there too, as well as other affiliated partisan organizations are all doing their voter mobilization. So there's a lot of attention paid to those states by the campaigns. Excuse me. But at the same time, voters are also aware that their votes are more likely to be determinative. And so the voters are more interested. They're following the news more closely, and they're more attentive to politics in these battleground states. So it's really that combination. And so if you look like at Texas, they're a very good example of a state that was off the battleground in 2016 and moving on to it in 2020. Not the most competitive state, but getting much more competitive. And you see turnout rise. It's still closer to the bottom in terms of overall turnout. So there's still some restrictive laws in the state, but clearly there's an appetite for voting in a state like that. If you were going to make one reform that would increase turnout nationally, it's a national popular vote, because it would mean that all votes are equal across the entire country. People in a state like Texas, and a lot of Republicans probably voting in Texas who wouldn't normally have voted because Texas was more competitive. Likewise, out in places like California and New York, there are Democrats who aren't participating and Republicans as well, because their states aren't competitive. So if I could just wave one magic wand and increase turnout rates everywhere, it would be a national popular vote. That would do a lot to increase turnout in the country.
So I'm going to try to sort of tie these together, some questions about mail voting. So we have, under that umbrella, we have the question, how many states have significant restrictions to mail voting? And then can you speak to rates of rejection of mail ballots and use of provisional ballots? And then I'm sure that's going to tie into information and what's going on with curing ballots and ballot cure rates.
Yeah, so we are collecting data on mail ballot rejections and analyzing that. My colleague Dan Smith at the University of Florida just put out a report about mail ballot rejections in Florida. And the good news, and we can see this across the country so far, the rate of mail ballot rejections went down. So that's the good news. The bad news, though, is actually once we get all that data in, and I've already been collecting data from the state, so I know this to be true, we're going to exceed the raw number of mail ballots that were rejected in 2016. And so even though the rate went down because we saw nearly doubling of mail ballot usage in the country, that increased usage is offsetting that decrease in, so I expect we'll be over 400,000 rejected mail ballots in the 2020 election, compared with about a little over 300,000 in 2016. And it could be that we're going to go even higher than that 400,000. There are some problem child states out there that I don't have data for yet. So I'm kind of nervous to see what happens with their rejections. But I'm already up at 350,000 that I can document from state sources talking with election officials. In terms of like who has their mail ballots more often rejected, again, you have to look at this voter file data to really get at this question. And we can see that they tend to be younger persons, persons of color, older people as well. And if you look at, say, signature verification, we can certainly see some issues in the way in which that is implemented. And it tends to be a non-uniform way across the state. And it does seem that in certain places we see higher rejection rates that are correlated with persons of color, for example, or younger voters in some places than others. And that's a little troubling when we start looking at the data to see, the laws ought to be applied fairly. And yet there's a lot of local discretion in how local election officials interpret signatures, process ballots, reach out to voters to try to correct those errors. There's a lot of discretion that's allowed in the system. And we can see some what appears to be discrimination as a consequence of that. So again, we're just now starting to dig into it. We've got some preliminary data from some of the states where we have good data from, like Florida, and we're going to be doing some additional analyses and try to really get deeper at this question as to who gets their ballots rejected and what the reasons are too, because that's also another, we talk about overall numbers of rejected ballots, but when you look at the state policies, there are some policies that actually lead to more rejected ballots, like having a witness signature. Does that signature need to go on a privacy envelope inside another envelope, the return envelope for the ballot? That seems to actually be an impediment to a good number of places to have that dual ballots. And maybe people recall what happened in Pennsylvania around something called naked ballots, ballots that weren't placed inside that inner envelope when they were required to by law. That sort of thing, those things matter. And again, if you get way down into the weeds and you look at implementation, there are things that could be done. No, you don't really need that inner secrecy envelope. There's no real purpose for it. You could put the signature on the outside, and there are election officials across the country who are innovating on this. Like, if you're going to require a signature, make sure that the envelope that requires a signature on it has a big red arrow pointing where you need the signature. These little simple things on design that I know that there are organizations that do that sort of work, but these things matter, and it can reduce the number of ballot rejections.
I think on that same wavelength is a question pertaining to equity, because to me, I see having a consistent and straightforward set of rules and systems, not necessarily federally governed, but could be governed at the state or mandated at the state level, but just to really keep things clear and consistent for voters and easy for them. So obviously there's all those mail ballot ideas and ways that you can do that. but we have a question about vote centers versus voting precincts. So I don't even know if this is really in your wheelhouse, Michael, but can you speak to whether it would be more equitable to have that vote center as opposed to the voting precincts, or is it ideal to have both?
I think voting centers is better than precincts, and there are a few reasons why. One, you can, if you locate them properly, and you have enough of them, so there's implementation issues here. So you could, if you were being a bad actor, and we know of instances of places doing this, you could put all your vote centers at inaccessible locations, and make it difficult for people to vote. But if you're putting them in highly trafficked areas where it's easy for people to get to, either through mass transit or are located so that they're uniformly just located throughout a county, then they can work. And voters have an option of where they're going to go to. You can have larger facilities so they can process more voters through them. That's one of the innovations that Kentucky struck upon in a good way during the primaries, was let's use convention centers as polling locations. Unfortunately, Kentucky also said, we're only going to have one location, which was not a good practice. So I think that probably there were people in Kentucky who weren't able to participate because they couldn't get to that single location for voting. But yes, let's use sporting facilities and convention centers and large facilities as places to vote. It helps process a larger number of people. Those are places that are built for that processing. So you're going to have shorter lines if you have more polling locations. And the other benefit you have too is more voting machines, I should say, not polling locations. But another benefit is that when you can consolidate your poll workers so that you can staff those polling locations with actual staff from the elections office. And you want to do this throughout your entire early voting period. When I say vote centers, I'm thinking of it in terms of having an early voting period where you also have these vote centers open. I'm not thinking about just having them on election day itself and that being the only day you have them. But if you do that, there have been studies that find that these vote centers, when well positioned and open for periods of time, can increase turnout rates by 4 to 5 percentage points. So I'm in favor of them. They can reduce costs, they can improve voter experiences, they can ensure that you have better staffing and reduce staffing requirements for all the polling locations. You don't have to have so many polling locations open, which is a difficulty for election officials, especially over the last year, as we found, when many places didn't want their facilities to be a polling location. So just many, many benefits that you can have with vote centers. I think they're a better way to go than polling locations.
Thank you. I do recognize we have hit an hour. So for everyone who has to drop off now, I appreciate you attending. I want to say again, thank you to Michael and Caroline, but I do have one question that I think will be a really good one to end on, and it is about voter trust. We're seeing turnout go up, but confidence in these systems actually going down. So I'll have Caroline start and we'll give Michael the last word. What can we be doing to rebuild the trust of voters in the election system?
Yeah, that is a really tough one. I'm gonna go a little bit back to what I said about nonprofits, but I think this extends to really friends and family, which is that like people are always gonna listen to the people they trust around them, the people that they interact with. They get their recommendations of who to go to the doctor to, and just really talking to the people in your network that you have the most influence on, and just educating based on trusted sources, election officials, kind of the research that's coming out of here, and just starting that dialogue with the people that you have the most influence over. That's what I'm gonna say in your community.
I would say information is an important part of the discussion, and we could see it cutting both ways in this last election. Clearly, there were people who were getting the word that they needed to get their ballots in sooner, and they were doing that, and people were changing their behavior so they were listening. They were trying to take steps to make sure that their ballots were being counted by using online portals and checking the status of their ballot. And so there were a lot of good things that were happening in terms of the communication that was happening. There's also the negative things too. It's quite frankly, it was the negative messaging coming from Donald Trump about mail ballots was driving Republicans away from voting in that safe method. And the rhetoric over mail ballot fraud has affected Republicans' perceptions on the integrity of the election. And if we're looking at one way in which we can increase trust in elections, it's just simply getting out the correct information that there was very little fraud in the election. Now, unfortunately, I think too that election officials, through all the best intentions, wanted to be as transparent as they possibly could and thought that the transparency would improve election perceptions of election integrity. So they would set up webcams and have of people counting ballots and doing the sort of activities around election administration. And unfortunately, those bad actors who wish to undermine our faith in our democracy weaponized that transparency against our election officials. And so they would take video out of context. Oh, that guy who walked over with a crumpled piece of paper in his hand, he dropped it in that waste paper basket. He was throwing away a ballot. And that literally happened in Georgia. And the guy had death threats against him. And that's just one of many, many, many examples of where people have been using, actively using disinformation campaigns to undermine confidence in elections. And I don't know where we can go with this. Social media platforms have at least started to take some steps against this. That's probably a good direction to go to try and suppress the misinformation that's intentional to try to undermine confidence in our democracy. But they're not sufficient. It's obvious that they're not. We just had just a couple of days ago where activists in Arizona claimed to have found a bunch of ballots that were shredded from the Maricopa County Elections Office. And of course, that didn't happen, but it's, Facebook had over 100,000 likes and views on it already. And that was just a couple of days ago. So these are, I don't really know where we go on that sort of different, how do we put a lid on that sort of disinformation when there's a group of people who are actively trying to undermine faith in elections. And so I wish I had better news. I can say though, getting out information did matter. And so we're the positive news information we're getting out there does matter. It's just that it's really is a battle here, and unfortunately, where we should all be on the same page on all sides of the political spectrum supporting our democracy. We're not there at the moment, and we need to find some way to get common ground to get us all there.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, Caroline, to everyone who attended and is looking through the America Goes to the Polls report. Thank you for your support. We will again send you that this recording and the slides and links to the webinar, the toolkit, the report, etc., to your emails next week. And until next time, thank you. Have a great day.